skipping it. So I'm going to ask our speakers to come to the table, and we're going to start with Suzanne, then Naomi, and then Peter.
Thank you very much, Cristine, for that very gracious introduction. And thank you all for coming out today in the snow. I mean, it was really coming down a while ago. And I asked to have this slide, this image put up here. It's also from the What's Up With That blog, which, you know, I don't mean to sort of be doing marketing on one particular climate change denier blog. It just sort of this is a big one. But I wanted to sort of let you have a look at the headlines, because I think these are so typical of the debate around climate change in this country. In some sections of the media, small blogs, but also in conservative media. So what do you see here? You see snow in 49 of 50 states. You know, as if to say, well, if there's snow, there cannot be climate change, because climate change is global warming. If there's so much snow, how can we believe that the climate is changing? You know, and if you go further down, or you know, that these same kind of things are in there. They're making fun, mocking scientists, and taking what appears to be a scientific look, at various, oops, I think we went a little too high. Oh, Justin Gillis thing. Taking a look at what appears to be scientific papers as if it's engaging in scientific debate. But what I wanted to sort of showcase here is that this actually isn't about science. The debate about climate change is not about science. It's not being conducted by scientists, because that debate is over. It's settled. It's a debate about politics. And in particular, if you look at it, look at the lines that come out here in this very last set of headlines. If the year were, sorry Naomi, if this year were 65 and this was the Soviet Union, then he was writing in Pravda, and I don't know what CAJW was, climate, something global warming, I don't know that acronym, I have to confess, was required party line. So you can see here very emotional political language, and it's a kind of emotional language that you see in sort of hard right sort of settings, because I think for the general American public, people aren't that concerned about communism right now. I think we can fairly say that sort of that vote is sailed. But what's happened, and why I think it's important to understand the atmosphere in which the debate about climate change takes place, both in the public sphere and, you know, and in the media, is that this is a debate about politics, and it's very much a debate that is being generated and circulated from the conservative or extreme conservative side of the political spectrum. So by this, I think it's important for people to realize the degree to which the Congress is dominated in the Republican side by people, elected officials, who deny the science behind climate change or are actively opposed to setting limits on the carbon emissions that cause climate change. These statistics are from a blog called put out by the Center for American Progress, and they've sort of counted, you know, looked at different statements made by various members of the Republican Party who are elected to the House, and apparently something like 58% of Republicans in the House deny the science behind climate change. There's a slightly higher portion among in the Senate, 60-odd%. So you've got 130 members of the House Republican caucus and 30 members of the Senate who deny the existence of climate change or oppose action on climate change. And they do this much because of the justification we saw there, that there is an argument within among some sections of the conservatives and a section of the conservatives that are important electorally, that they see action on climate change as a power grab, right? They see that once you start to regulate emissions, then it's just one step away to one big government, our freedom's taken away, and right to individuality is gone, and no one can do business anymore. So it's really, the debate now is really very, very highly polarized and very political. And this means that journalists who are trying to cover climate change, which if you asked me, is a topic that involves science, politics, policy, and economics, and communications, that it makes the process of trying to cover this very large and sprawling and complicated topic, it makes this process very difficult, very combustible, and challenging in a way that I haven't seen in other areas that I've reported on, or in other areas of the world. Except maybe, the Israel-Palestine conflict, where everything you write is very closely scrutinized and people are very mobilized. In some ways, I find, I was based there for many years, for 2.5 years, and I find some similarities there in terms of the deep passions that you see sometimes, and in terms of the sophistication that arguments are carried out about the media, the role of the media, etc. So journalists are operating, I think, in quite a combustible atmosphere, quite a highly charged, politicized atmosphere. And it's also, quite treacherous terrain, because if you come from your basic reporting tradition, one of the things that is sacrosanct is this idea, to borrow a word from Fox News, of fair and balanced, and what that means to you. How do you ensure that your coverage is representative of what is going on, and that you are giving space, or some amount of space, to the different voices out there? I think this is a problem when you come to the world of climate denial, because these voices are very much at the fringe, right? And yet we continue to see these voices being inserted into coverage as if they were part of the mainstream debate. And that really is not the case. And you'll see that in quite an insidious way. So you're going to see the kind of jokes about the weather and global warming. I've pulled them up from a climate denier blog that, is probably not seen by a lot of people. But I bet if you switch on the weather reports or some morning show, you will see similar jokes. Almost, you could sort of count them, that they always make the sort of evening broadcast of the news. Now, you could flip the weather situation another way. You could look at the Olympics and sort of see pictures of Sochi, and there's concern in this Olympics and in the one in Vancouver that there's not enough snow, that you can't ski, that if you do ski, you're skiing in short sleeves because of climate change. But those kind of connections aren't often being made. Instead, what I find that I see on sort of television quite often are the sort of climate change jokes. Oh, who says it's global warming? Look, it's snowing outside. So those things that might start off in the denier sphere, so-called, do percolate down to mainstream media, and they also result in this sort of over-representation, I would say, of these minority fringe voices in regular news copy. I think that's a problem. I think that's a problem because it's not an accurate depiction of what is going on in the way the scientific community views climate change. It is not an accurate depiction of the way the business community views climate change. And it's not an accurate depiction of the way government views climate change, because while the Congress may have a heavy contingent of people in the Republican side who officially and publicly deny the existence of climate change on the ground, at the city, state, and even the federal government level, government officials are actively engaged in efforts to try and deal with climate change. They are going about, trying to come up with new solutions to prevent sea level rise and you know, to protect people from climate change. Republicans are really behind in the states, are really behind the idea of renewable energy. They're behind solar panels. So I think having this idea of false balance overstates the importance of what are essentially kind of fringe groups that have thrust themselves into positions of prominence. Now, I know some of these fringe groups pretty well because part of my job is to cover them. And let me just tell you a little bit about what it's like. One of these groups that's pretty well known is something called the Heartland Institute. And you can see them quoted quite frequently in the media. An expert called James Taylor who's quoted quite frequently. Now, this is an organization whose funding comes from, and I'm sure Naomi's going to talk about this at length, but their funding comes from anonymous donors who probably are wealthy, extremely conservative ideologues, as well as some industry. And they purport to be scientists. But if you actually go to any of their conferences, I mean, it's quite clear that these people aren't conducting any kind of science, because you know, you sort of go to these very grand and lavish conferences. I mean, the first one I went to was at Times Square, and was really, really I think it was really fancy. You know, if you go to academic conferences, they're not really fancy, in my experience. So this was some great hotel in Times Square, free food, really good buffet. And people, sorry, it was good. And you go to the seminars, and it's like you've entered the twilight zone, because people are there, you know, talking about these issues that you have thought had been settled in the 70s. And I'm not just talking about climate change. I mean, I went into one seminar, and one guy was giving a very passionate speech about why we needed to be spraying more DDT. The DDT is good. You should be spraying DDT across, you know, you should be fogging Africa with DDT, and malaria would be eradicated, and it was a shame that there was environmental regulation against DDT. I mean, these are the kinds of, this is the kind of stuff that goes on. If, you know, in another section, they had a bit where they were trying to put together this report that they put out all this time. That's kind of one of these sham, dummy, you know, fake report or faux report, faux scientific report. And they just had people signing up on a sort of easel. You know, do you want a peer review? Do you want to do this? I mean, it was really quite shockingly amateur, and anyone could sign up and sort of say, oh, I'm kind of interested in, you know, the sunspots. I'd like to write about sunspots, and they'd say, okay, there you go. So, I mean, if you see the inner workings of these places, as I did, it's really quite shocking at how, you know, sort of tawdry and, you know, really quite small bore they are, and how far removed they are from science, and how far removed they are from anything to do with scientific thought, you know, or to, you know, or even really wanting to debate science or have a critical discussion about science, because it's really, really all about the politics, and it's perpetrated by a fringe element of the politics, and yet this creates problems for journalists very much, to a great degree. I mean, there's a false balance issue, I find, you know, that we take our traditional journalistic ways of covering things and think that you have to give two, you know, equal time to both voices. That creates a problem. But there are other problems, I think, that even have to do with how you call, what you call these people. And we've had agonizing debates at The Guardian about them. Do we call these people climate change deniers? I mean, they deny the existence of climate change. But if you do that, then these people come back at you and say, well, you're accusing me of being a Holocaust denier. And you're like, oh, we weren't talking about the Holocaust. So then we thought, well, maybe we should call you climate skeptics. But actually, these people have already made up their minds about stuff. They're not skeptical. This isn't a skeptical period of inquiry. So that also becomes problematic. So this is something very challenging for the media to deal with. It's challenging also in this sort of sense of an old media, new media sense, because what happens now is the debate now is being formed and shaped outside the so-called legacy media in which I work, vehicles that started out as print and continue as print in some parts. I mean, very often the debate is on Twitter, it's on Facebook, it's on blogs like this, and it's circulated around. And very often reporters are attacked, almost sort of reflexively when they write a story that talks about climate change. So for example, I am routinely referred to as warmist Suzanne Goldberg because I believe in global warming. And I am followed on Twitter by people who disagree with everything I say, but they want to just sort of circulate it, see what I say, and then call me an alarmist, and circulate it. So there is this sort of interaction that 5 years ago in the pre-Twitter age wouldn't have existed. So in terms of what I think we need to do as journalists, and for me what I think is useful is one, I think it's important to know who you're dealing with. I think we need to call out, not in a political way, but in a very factual way, who these people are, to point out that this is not about a dispute among scientists. We should not treat it as a dispute among scientists. It's a debate about politics, and it's a political fight. I think that needs to be understood. And I think the second thing is that we shouldn't get discouraged or think that these people are stopping action on global warming. They're not. They're not. There's a struggle, but this is kind of the last gasp of a dying empire. That you know that there will be a response to climate change. It's going to be too small. It's going to be too slow. But these people are actually losing. And third, you can't cede the ground there as journalists, and we're people who believe in an accurate representation of the world around us. I think one thing that journalists need to keep on doing is to keep on reporting from the ground and keep on reporting about how things are affecting people's lives. When I go, and I actually try to do that, when I go out and do reporting trips, last year at about this time, I went out to Alaska, and I went to this small village on the Bering Strait, and you could probably see Russia from there, but it was certainly closer.
Now you're right from Russia, right?
And now, yeah, and you can probably, and it's actually closer to Russia than Anchorage. And if you talk to any villager there, right, they will tell you climate change is happening because they can see it on the ground around them. They can see that the Arctic sea ice is retreating. They don't have that buffer between the strong winds and the seas. It's eroding the land out from underneath them. They know that their village is threatened. They fully believe the projections that show that one day their village will be underwater because the land is eroding. And in fact, I was in Indiana reporting on the drought. And if you look at Indiana, conservative state, or it's switched a bit, but quite conservative bedrock state. And if you talk to farmers there on the ground, they will tell you about years of drought. They will tell you the seasons are changing from when they grew up. So I think, the people are accepting evidence of climate change, whether they may express it in those ways, and we probably will talk a lot about terms going forward. And I think if we keep reporting on that, I think that's what the real story is.
Great, thanks. Naomi, thank you.
Look, thanks very much, and thanks to Chris for inviting us all here today. So Chris asked me to talk a little bit about my work, my research on this topic, and how I got involved in this issue, and what I learned through 10 years of research. And I haven't gone to a Heartland conference, but I feel like I have, because I've gone inside the Heartland through their documents, through historical documents, to tell us about who these people are, and who funds them, and why. So for me, the story, though, began actually with journalism. It began around the year 2001 when I was working on a quite different topic, or at least I thought it was a different topic, the history of oceanography. But in the course of writing a book about oceanographic research in the 20th century, I came across historical materials from oceanographers who in the 1950s first began to worry about global climate change, anthropogenic climate change. And these included people like Roger Revelle, which is a name that maybe some people around here know, Charles Keeling, who we now have the Keeling curve named after. And if I say something that you don't know what I'm talking about, like raise your hands or something like that. Does everybody here know what the Keeling curve is? Yeah? No? Yes? Yeah? That'd be slang. Okay, no? Okay, well Dave Keeling started measuring carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in 1957-58 as part of the International Geophysical Year. We now have a long time series measurement that shows us very clearly how much carbon dioxide has increased in the atmosphere since the late 1950s, and that's known as the Keeling curve. There's not a scientist on this planet that doesn't accept that that's a factually correct measurement of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the Keeling curve is now engraved on the wall of the National Academy of Sciences in Washington, D.C., next to an engraving of the double helix and Darwin's finches. So from a scientific point of view, it's absolutely established science, as established as you could possibly hope or dream of as a scientist, right? So there's Dave Keeling next to Darwin. So Dave Keeling started measuring carbon dioxide because he and a group of other oceanographers recognized that carbon dioxide had the potential to warm the planet. And they started to argue back in the 1950s that we should start measuring it in order to be able to say, 10, 20, 30 years in the future, whether or not the Earth's climate was warming in response to it. And for me as a historian, that's a little bit of a scary thing to think about. So I was born in 1958. I was born in the same year as the Keeling curve. When I realized that, I thought, oh, this really is my destiny. And then I got to know Dave Keeling, so there were a lot of pieces of the story that actually connected for me on a personal level. It's very sad to me to think that Dave Keeling thought that, well, he believed from his own work, by 1965, he felt that he had enough data to say, yes, carbon dioxide is increasing, and yes, this will impact the climate. And he and his colleagues mostly thought that by the 70s or 80s or 90s, we would know for sure and we would start to do something about it. And the interesting thing about that, I mean, Roger Revelle was a very savvy person, and he was both a scientist and a politician and a professor at the Kennedy School. And he thought that once we had the scientific evidence, once the science was clear, then we would develop appropriate policy action. And sometimes when I think about Revelle, I feel really sad. Because, you know, it was such a good vision, and it wasn't silly at that time. In the 1960s, there was good reason to think that we might act on scientific information. But as we know, it's not what happened. The first part did happen. The science did become clear. By the 1970s, virtually all experts who were working in the area, true experts, and you actually call the Hartland people experts, so whoops, I gotcha. Real experts, scientists working on the issue, all believed that global warming would occur because of the increase in carbon dioxide. And that was stated by the National Academy of Sciences in 1979. They knew that carbon dioxide had risen. They believed that it would cause climate change, but they did not yet think that we had enough evidence to say that that climate change was underway. That second step to say, yes, it's happening, came about in the early 1990s and was formalized by the IPCC in 1995 in the Seventh Assessment Report, where they said that the human fingerprint had become, quote, discernible. And there's a whole backstory about a 3-day argument it took to decide on what that word was. So by the 1990s, we knew that climate change was happening. I started doing this research just shortly after that, in the early 2000s. And in doing this research, I came to appreciate how old this science was and really how well established it was and how it had really been built up over the course of the previous half a century. And from a point of view of a historian of science, that's a lot of time. 50 years worth of scientific work published in peer-reviewed journals, ratified by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. That's pretty solid from a historian's standpoint. And yet, as a citizen, I was reading the newspaper, I was reading the legacy papers, as you call it, and reading in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times that there was this big debate about climate change. And it was right around that time that we also had that big EPA report that some of you may remember, in which the EPA changed the report under the direction of the Bush administration, claiming that there was, you know, a lack of consensus about it. And so as the sort of partly as a citizen and partly as a historian, I thought, well, wait a second. The media have got this all wrong. The media don't understand this. And I was, at that time, thinking this as a media problem. I thought that the media just did not understand the state of science. And I thought, well, that's kind of understandable, because really, let's face it, I mean, I'm a historian digging in the dusty archives. It's pretty lonely in the archives, you know, there's not too much company. So it wouldn't really be that surprising or that shocking or that terrible if a political journalist didn't know this stuff. I mean, you wouldn't really expect them to, right? So I wrote an article trying to explain this. And what I did was, basically, I reviewed the major scientific reports that had been written on the issue and said, look, all of the leaders of all of the major scientific societies in the United States, the National Academy of Sciences, the IPCC, all of these groups, all say that climate change is happening. But then I thought to myself, well, okay, but, if I were skeptical, if I was genuinely skeptical, I might say, well, it's one thing for the leadership of an institution to say something, it's another thing for the rank and file to believe it. I mean, let's face it, as we all know, just because Larry Summers said something doesn't mean that all Harvard faculty agree. So I thought, we need to do a little more work. We need to dig a bit, we need to drill down below the level of, the leaders of the National Academy of Sciences to find out what rank and file scientists think. And so I thought for a little while about how I could do that, and I thought, well, I can do that. I can review this published scientific data using something called the ISI database, the Institute for Scientific Information, which some of you may know about, which tracks and indexes all papers published in peer-reviewed scientific journals around the globe. So this is the best source of information we have about what is being published in the peer-reviewed journal, what claims are passing peer review, and therefore what claims we can say are scientific claims. And so I did a research project. I downloaded all of the abstracts of all of the articles we could find that had been published in the previous 10 years on the topic of global climate change, and asked the question, how many of these papers disagree with the position stated by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences that most of the observed warming of the last 50 years is likely to have been due to the increase in greenhouse gas concentration. So it's a very clearly stated hypothesis. This is the claim. It comes from the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. Can we find rank and file scientists who don't agree with that? And the answer was no. And early on we talked about the percentage. So we had a sample of about 1,000 papers, essentially a random sample. In that sample of 1,000 peer-reviewed papers, there was not one paper that disagreed with the Academy position. And I have to say that I was shocked by that, because even though I knew that the press was misrepresenting the situation, I didn't know how bad it was. I thought, no one I knew at the University of California took a contrarian or denialist position, but I thought, well, look, I'm in the land of Roger Revelle. We're obviously very advanced in San Diego. We've been working on this issue for 50 years. I can't assume that the people I'm surrounded by here are necessarily representative. So I thought that we would find, I don't know, maybe 5%, maybe 10%, maybe 15%, and the answer was none. So I published this in Science Magazine. Subsequently, other people have done follow-up studies. Other people have done larger, bigger follow-ups with larger samples. Recently, there was a study that brought my study up to date. And the correct number, by the way, since it came up in the introduction, is not 85. It's 97 to 99% of all publishing scientists are consistent on this position. So this is about as good as it gets. I don't think you could find any topic in science where you have 100% agreement. We know people who don't think that DNA carries hereditary information. We know people who don't believe in plate tectonics. People at this institution who don't believe in quantum mechanics. So there's always going to be a few outliers, and that's okay. No big deal. They're entitled to their opinion. But from a public policy standpoint, or from a standpoint of trying to say what does established science tell us, this is absolutely, beyond any reasonable doubt. There is no disagreement in the scientific community about the basic question of whether or not climate change is happening now, and whether or not it's largely driven by increased greenhouse gas concentrations from burning fossil fuels. That is not disputed in the scientific community. And in my paper, I was very clear, took pains to make it clear exactly what the claim was. So when I said there's a consensus, I didn't just say, oh, there's just a consensus about everything, right? Which of course would be silly. It's a consensus about this very specific claim. Okay, so that paper got published in 2004 in Science Magazine, the leading peer-reviewed journal in America. And I thought, and I got some nice feedback from journalists who said it was very helpful. And I thought, good, everything's hunky-dory. I did what I wanted to do. Move on, go back to my book. Well, that's not what happened. What happened was my life changed because two things happened. Al Gore read my paper and put the results in an inconvenient truth. And that was a funny evening when I got a call actually from a colleague here in Boston who had read about it in the Boston Globe. Someone from the Boston Globe had seen the paper and kind of made the connection between the film and the paper and said, oh, in Al Gore's film there's this very interesting part where he draws on Naomi Oreskes' work about the scientific consensus. And in the film he doesn't mention me by name, he just sort of gives the result. He says, they did a study, it's like the Royal Bay. But this reporter recognized it, and someone sent me this piece. And that night at the dinner table I said to my then teenage daughters, so, I have some news. I'm in Al Gore's new film. And my teenage daughter looks at me and goes, you? You're an Howard film? Right? So, in any event, so that was good. That was fun. I thought that's exciting. I went and saw the film. That was a good movie. Later on, I got to meet Alan, get to know him a little bit. But here's the thing. Within weeks, literally weeks, I started getting hate mail. Threatening phone calls. My dean, my department chair, started getting letters complaining about me, accusing me of being a fraudulent historian, saying, well, obviously there's a debate. If Oreskes can't find it, she's obviously incompetent. That was a nice little piece of logic, you know. I mean, and some much worse things. I was a communist, I was a fascist, I was a Stalinist, and worse. I was ugly, I had bad taste in shoes. Yeah, that was the worst. I know. After that, I had to go out and buy a lot more shoes. Since that until I have good taste in shoes, though I am wearing boots today because of this now. Okay, so this was weird. You know, it's funny to think back. I had no idea what I had walked into. I had no idea what landmine I'd stepped on. And I'm sort of sympathetic in a way to scientists who have experienced the same thing because they didn't know we were there. Because what I started to learn very quickly was I wasn't alone, that actually I was in amazingly good company, that I was part of a group of amazing scientists who had also been the subject of attack. And so I started talking to a few different people about what was going on. And no one really quite knew what was going on. We just knew that we were getting these weird letters and complaints from strange people. And so I gave a talk in a meeting of fellow historians of science, and I sort of, in a Q&A, this came up, and I said, yeah, there's this kind of weird thing going on, I don't know what's happening. But I mentioned some of the attacks were coming from one particular person who I mentioned by name. And after I talked about this, a colleague came up to me, someone I didn't know at the time, but now my good colleague, Ellie Conway, and he came up to me and he said, Naomi, you know, this person who's attacking you is the same person who attacked Sherry Rowland over the scientific evidence of the ozone hole. And I thought, what? And then I thought, really? The same person attacked Sherry Rowland is attacking me? Like, Sherry Rowland is, you know, one of the heroes of the 20th century. I mean, a towering figure, a Nobel Prize winning scientist, and one of the rare scientists of the 20th century who has managed to be both a towering figure scientifically and also a towering humanitarian who spoke out in public in a very effective way about the threat that ozone depletion represented to the world, and was able to mobilize the scientific community in an effective, politically effective way to bring about the Montreal Protocol and see effective policy action on a really important environmental issue. So, I mean, just a heroic figure, and if any of you have met him, a wonderful, wonderful person as well. So I said, Derek, that's so weird, right? And then he started telling me what he knew about this, and it turned out he had written a book about the history of atmospheric science, or he was finishing this book, and he had a chapter on the history of ozone depletion. And so he had this whole story that he hadn't actually put in the book, because the book was supposed to be a history of science, and he was thinking, well, that was the politics part, and that was sort of, I don't know, a side story. So he said, yeah, there was this whole thing about a whole campaign to discredit the science related to ozone. So to try to make the long story short, I only have 5 minutes left, but you invited me to talk about this. It's hard to talk at your own work in just 5 minutes. To try to make a long story short, Eric and I started working together, and 5 years later we finished writing the book Merchants of Doubt. And what we did in this book was to try to figure out what the heck was going on here. To tell the story of why were people attacking climate scientists? Why did people attack the scientists who laid out the issue of ozone depletion? And as we dug, we found a few key things. And I don't have a lot of time, so just to give you a few of the highlights. We wanted to trace the story back. We wanted to say, well, where did this come from? Who are these people? Why did they do what they did? And what we were able to show through historical research was that they came from the tobacco industry. And we do know a lot about who the Heartland Institute gets money from. In recent years, the last 2 or 3 years, Heartland has become more effective about hiding their sources. They've created these shell organizations, this thing called Donors Trust, that's very important right now. But they didn't used to be so clever, which is why it's always good to go back in time. People learn from their mistakes, which is why as a historian you always go back to the beginning before they learned. So there's a lot of documentation on this, and we know that the Heartland Institute received tens or even possibly hundreds of $millions from the Tobacco Institute and tobacco industry to fight the scientific evidence of the harms of tobacco. And not only that, but what we were able to show was it wasn't just that some of the same ideas were being used or the same same strategies, but the same people. Some of the very people who were attacking me about climate change, we could show that they had worked with the tobacco industry in the 70s, 80s, and 90s to attack the scientists who had worked on the harms of tobacco. And it's been interesting for me too, because this tobacco analogy is now like a lot of people know about it. And I sometimes go to meetings and conferences where someone will stand up and say, oh yeah, well it's like the tobacco industry. And I say, yeah, I know, I wrote that book. And then I say, but it's not just like it. It is the tobacco industry. This is not just an analogy. This is actually the same people, the same organization, and the same stream of money. And the story runs, it begins with tobacco, it runs through acid rain, it runs through the ozone hole, it runs through global warming, it runs through the history of DDT, which you can read about in our book. There's one more I think I'm leaving out, nuclear winter. It was kind of this amazing thing, right? This whole incredible story about science after science after science being attacked by the same people. And so then, of course, the question becomes why. Suzanne already gave away my punchline. It's a story about government regulation. It's a story about a kind of confluence of scientists who worked in the Cold War and had a very powerful anti-communist ideology, organizations like the Cato Institute and the American Enterprise Institute who take a public policy position against government intervention in the marketplace, fostering neoliberal economic principles, and regulated industries like the tobacco industry or the chemical industry who want to fight regulation that they think may impede their ability to do business. And so this has become a very powerful political force in the United States because it combines a set of interests that are both sort of vested economically, but also have a kind of overarching political ideology that makes it all make sense, even to people who may not hold stock in ExxonMobil. So it's not just about the fossil fuel industry funding disinformation. It's about a much more powerful alliance, which then taps into a kind of American cultural belief in the power of the individual, the importance of small government. And I always sort of start to think about Jefferson. You know, I'm a historian, so I have to push it back a little further. This is about a country in which many of us believe that the government that governs best governs least. And so part of why this has been so effective is because it taps into that belief. So it becomes an argument about big government. And that helps to explain why you see the Republican Party kind of doubling down on denial, as Bill Clinton memorably put it, right? Because they can connect it to their big issue, which is the issue of big government. So for Republicans in Congress and elsewhere, it's not about climate change. It's definitely not about the science. It's really about government. And the question of good governance, what constitutes governance, what is the appropriate role of the government in the marketplace, and how far should the government go to regulating threats to our health and safety? Over to you.
Thank you, Naomi. Thank you all for joining us. It's really an honor and a privilege to be part of this panel. I want to draw upon what both Suzanne and Naomi spoke to and kind of look forward. So the Union of Concerned Scientists, where I'm based, is an organization that is action-oriented. The goal is to bring about change. Right? In this case, it's to really look for opportunities to bring us to a place where we can really have evidence-based decision-making about climate and other issues. Climate change is not the only issue where we're challenged to do so at a federal level in this country. And so what are the opportunities so that when we come back to a panel 4 years from now, Chris, we're not...
10 years from now.
Or 10 years from now, you know, we're not just wringing our hands and saying, boy, those denialists, they're so powerful, the Congress is so inept. We're not able to get to a place where we can make decisions based on the edict, as I think Daniel Patrick Moynihan so nicely put it, where everyone feels everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but they're not entitled to their own facts. Right? Well, we can agree about what the true facts are, and then wrestle with what to do about it based on what the information we have at hand and our values. And that's a legitimate thing for us to do and for people to disagree upon. So what are the opportunities in front of us? Well, one, I think, is really, first of all, to learn from our mistakes. And so just to point to one, because it's very prominent in terms of the past year, Chris mentioned the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which came out with the first of 3 reports back in September, the Working Group 1 report, which is about the science of climate change, the basic atmospheric science, what do we know? And so that report contains tremendous information. It highlights, among many other things, the patterns of change that we're seeing associated with the warming that we're experiencing, that Arctic sea ice is declining, that it hit a record low in 2012, that the ice on land masses such as Greenland and West Antarctica continue to recede dramatically, that the heat content of the deep oceans is increasing dramatically, that sea level is rising and continues to rise. Actually, this report made clear that it's rising more quickly than it actually had been highlighted in the previous fourth assessment report. And that the global surface temperature of this past decade was warmer than any previous surface temperature of any decade since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. So you might imagine it would have been a great opportunity, kind of a teachable moment about what we're seeing. But how did it get reported? Well, a tremendous amount of the news coverage was about an apparent pause in global warming. Where did that come from? In fact, but many of the reporters, when they came to the session where the summary for policymakers was released, were peppering the authors, lead authors, with questions about the pause in global warming. And that's what much of the news coverage was. And it wasn't just in the, in the kind of denialist blogosphere. It was in the mainstream media. It was in CBS News. It was in NBC. It was in mainstream people. Everybody was talking about the pause. So where did that come from? Well, a lot of different places. It actually started, at least recently started, in terms of the past year, with an article in The Economist in March of last year, which, it's a very unusual article. It pointed to the fact that if you start with the year 1998, which was an El Nino year, a year in which which has natural forcings leading to a very high level of warmer temperatures, and you simply look forward to 2012 over a 15-year time frame, there hadn't been, if you just cherry pick those 2 points, a tremendous amount of warming, and the climate models didn't capture that. And so it began asking questions about why is there an apparent discrepancy between what we observed using that time frame and what the models project. And of course that was then picked up and amplified in the denialist blogosphere on Fox News, and became kind of the conversation. If you just do a Google search on global warming pause, it began, as one measure, it began to become amplified. It became the story. And then the IPCC was constrained by its own kind of rules, its rigid rules about engagement with the media, so that when, big surprise, a draft version of the report was leaked, was posted online, the language was pulled out of context in that draft report. The media and the blogosphere began talking about how the IPCC was confused over a pause in global warming, and the authors of the IPCC report actually couldn't respond. They couldn't respond. They couldn't say, well, actually, here's what we know. We know that Arctic sea ice is declining. We know that the heat content of the oceans is increasing. We know the sea level is rising. And there is no pause, because that's just cherry picking. They couldn't do that even if they had intended to, because they weren't allowed to. The rules of engagement was they couldn't speak to a report that was addressed. So everybody else could speak to it, but not to the authors. But the authors couldn't. And then when the final report came out, the material had already been seeded. That's what all the questions were about. It became kind of the meme of a pause in global warming that became widespread, so much so that the scientific community began speaking to it as well. In fact, there was just an article a couple of days ago that got some news coverage, a research piece of many that have appeared research articles explaining why we have a pause in global warming. And so the scientific community, the expert community, has sort of taken this. It's almost like when you're sitting in front of a classroom and someone asks you a question, you tend to repeat the question back and you use the language. So let me explain this to you, because as scientists we like to explain things. We like to just understand mysteries. Well, why is it apparently because those 2 years? But of course, interacting with the media is different than interacting with your student. And as scientists, both by the rules of engagement of the IPCC and as often as individuals who just haven't had training for how to interact with the media, and how to turn the question around so you can say, well, here's what I do know about the pace of warming, and simply not repeat the false representation of the pause in global warming, because that became what people saw. And so there was a tremendous amount of missed opportunity and misinformation associated in the media. I don't know how it's taken up in kind of opinion polls. I haven't seen any results on that. But clearly, all of the work that went into the IPCC's report, the first of the 3 assessments that are coming out, really missed an opportunity to speak to what we knew forcefully, clearly, and effectively across the public sphere. So there are things to learn from that, and I think the IPCC really needs to wrestle with how to put as much time and energy into communication as it does in preparing assessments. And I think we'll see some differences in the next assessment report. The second assessment will focus on impacts, coming out at the end of March. So that's one place where we can really look recently and say, there are some things we can do differently as a scientific community, so we don't simply reinforce the tendency of others to kind of create the storyline that really is inconsistent with the facts as we understand them. A second piece, I think, looking forward is that I think there's an opportunity for the media to do some things differently. Now, I can't speak to what the media should do, of course, but I've seen some hopeful signs. So the Los Angeles Times, for example, the editor of the letters page of the Los Angeles Times decided this fall that the Times would no longer publish letters to the editor that contained misinformation about climate change. It simply wouldn't do it. That's, to my knowledge, the first time a major mainstream newspaper has made such a decision. We've seen in other cases, I think Naomi has highlighted on the tobacco case, that in the academic literature, we've also seen some changes. The British Medical Journal, for example, on tobacco has decided as a matter of policy to no longer publish papers which have been funded by the tobacco industry, not just because of the potential conflict of interest, but because of their demonstrated record of denial and misinformation. And that's another way in which we can begin to see a bright line drawn between what we're willing to do as scientists and how we can communicate about it. I'd really like to see other major mainstream media outlets wrestle with the kind of policy that the LA Times set and make some decisions about what's acceptable to publish, both on their letters and on their editorial page. The Boston Globe in December published an op-ed by Jeff Jacoby, who's a conservative columnist, that totally misrepresented the data on the extent to which climate scientists agree on the facts of global warming, the basic facts of anthropogenic warming, and purported to demonstrate that, in fact, there's wide diversity of views, and we shouldn't have a small majority decide what the climate science community is intended to understand in the public. I think it's really outrageous, frankly, that the Globe would allow that kind of piece to be published on its opinion page. And I think, again, there are opportunities for the mainstream media to begin to make sensible judgments, just as they wouldn't probably publish something about, about dinosaurs and humans walking near it at the same time. There are points at which... well, maybe they will. All right. Maybe that's a bad example. But we should really move past the kind of false balance representation of information in mainstream media. I think there are opportunities to do that. I think there's an opportunity to drive a conversation about responsibility of climate change and responsibility for damages associated with climate change. And I say this for several reasons. So even if there's confusion in the public, and there remains confusion in the public if you ask about, so do scientists agree, they haven't read Naomi's paper, or most of them, of course not surprisingly, and there is a lot of confusion about whether scientists, experts agree on whether global warming is underway and human caused. But it's interesting because people are able to hold more than one thought in their head at the same time, right? And often they may be conflicted. So if you ask people whether what they're seeing at the local level in terms of extreme weather or coastal flooding associated with sea level rise, is whether that's associated with human caused global warming, let's say yes. A much larger majority of people in a broad range of polls will link the local impacts associated with extreme heat, for example, as we've seen in Texas and the Southeast over the last couple of years, California now associated with the drought. They'll say, yeah, they are concerned about the warming impacts, even if they think that scientists disagree. That with the things that they're experiencing in their own lives, they're connecting to climate change. Not always accurately, it's kind of a folk attribution, and so people will also do this with tornadoes, even though the science is not strong on tornadoes being made worse or more extreme by climate change. On the one hand, we have people who are connecting the dots. We have science that's now connecting the dots. So it's possible to say, for example, that the 2003 European heat wave that resulted in 80,000 excess deaths was made that the risk of that, when it occurred, was twice as likely to be at that level of severity as it would have been in the 1960s because of anthropogenic warming. Similarly, we've seen similar results with the Russian heat wave in 2010, and with the kinds of extreme heat that we've seen now in the U.S. We can begin to connect the dots between the increased risk of severe weather, particularly heat, and global warming. There's a body of research that now allows us to do this. There's an opportunity in front of us that Naomi and I, and actually other colleagues, are beginning to do to really begin to connect our understanding of damages for climate change with building the conversation about, well, who's responsible for that damages? Why should taxpayers be paying for the damages associated with Superstorm Sandy or extreme heat? Why is it only the taxpayers? Why not, for example, the fossil industry that's been responsible not only for a major contribution to the emissions that we see, but also, as we need to document more fully and more effectively, responsible for a record of denial and delay, much as they have been with the tobacco case. So I think there's an opportunity. Suzanne wrote a very nice piece on some recent research around this back in November to, what's that?
Thanks.
To really make that case. And finally, I just want to highlight that even as the public is confused about global warming, certainly at a large scale, less so at a local scale, they are not necessarily connecting that to whether or not they support climate solutions. Right? So certainly at a state level, so if we take it out of the federal level, we now have 29 states and the District of Columbia in the United States that have renewable electricity standards, where they're mandating an increased proportion of their electricity to come from low-carbon renewable sources. Over the past year, there have been efforts by some of the denial campaigns, the American Legislative Exchange Council in particular, to try to focus on misinformation about renewable energy and actually try to undermine the legislation taking place in many states. And they did this in 13 states over the past year, including very conservative states like Kansas, North Carolina. And they failed in each one of them. What the public is basically saying, I'm not connecting renewable energy to climate change. That's really not the issue. They basically like the policy. They like the fact that renewable energy in these states is encouraging jobs. And so there really isn't a debate about global warming in the context of these efforts to overturn renewable electricity standards. So we can recognize opportunities at a state level, including in California, which has a major climate policy in place supported on a bipartisan basis, that really steps out of the Washington fray and enables a conversation on a bipartisan basis to be supportive of clean energy, even in the face of efforts to promote denial and to roll back those efforts. Now, that's not going to get us as far as we need. We certainly need federal action, in my view, and that's going to require a different kind of politics, and one that really is evidence-based at a national scale. But I think the opportunity is in front of us to build that up from the ground at a state level, and to build resilience, if you will, to misinformation that then can translate into federal policy is an important place for us to be focusing on this. So thank you.
Well, excuse me, I want to thank the panel, and I don't know if we want to make any comments between the panelists, but I guess I would just make 2 points. Listening to Naomi, I was reminded that as a young, starting out science reporter in Washington, D.C. in the late 70s for the afternoon newspaper, the Washington Star, I covered the Surgeon General's report every year, and I would call the Tobacco Institute, which was just required, because tobacco was so powerful in Washington, and in Capitol Hill and whatever, everyone was very strongly supported by tobacco money. And so I did at some point, as a science reporter, say, but this is a report about science, so I don't want to call the Tobacco Institute, because they just say, there's no proof, absolute proof, that tobacco or smoking causes lung cancer. They even said at that point. I said, nobody believes this. And then my editor said, well, call them anyway. But I think things change when you look, even though there's still a huge global tobacco problem and U.S. problem, the politics changed dramatically. And, there has been a huge shift in the way people perceive that, and a complete shift in the way science is used in that debate. You just don't have anybody saying, well, who says tobacco causes cancer? So that's unfortunately quite a long time ago, but things have changed. The other thing, maybe you all could comment briefly, just listening on language came up quite a bit today. And it is a challenge to cover these issues, even just starting down, as Suzanne was pointing out, what you call each side and how you deal with those issues. You know, it's like the abortion, you know, I'm pro-choice. There's so many ways of framing it. But one thing that just was used universally was the media, as if it's a singular. And so I'm always like objecting, you know, don't blame the media, because if, as never before, it's a very diverse population of media, and to some degree everyone is their own media commentator these days. So I think blaming the media has always been popular, and I can join in that, but it's quite a challenge on the language. And even scientists, and I heard it again today, use the word, well, I believe in global warming or climate change, as if it's a belief system. And a lot of the polling, public opinion polling, always has that word belief. And I know a lot of the groups that have been fighting the evolution battle around the country for a long time, they keep saying this over and over, which is where I learned it. You know, it's not do you believe in evolution. I mean, it's an established scientific theory, and again, even that word is troublesome. So I don't know how we improve the language, because we were throwing around climate change rather than some of the denialists will say, well, I believe in climate change, but just natural climate change. And then Peter was using anthropogenic, which is just not one that's so easy to use, you know, human-caused, whatever. So maybe, Suzanne, you can talk a little bit about the challenges of even what language you use in the story. And then I'd like Naomi and Peter to comment on sharing the blame a little bit. What a challenge it is for the scientific community to be able to communicate on these issues. It's really kind of a late recognition that maybe they need to be better communicators, and even on this IPCC report, the climate denial movement were part of the leaking of it and part of the advanced publicity to kind of frame and create the controversy before the report even came out. So if you could talk about language from the media perspective, and Naomi and Peter could talk about what, again, looking forward and being not just hand-reading, what we could do about the scientific community or the quote, experts talking in a way that could reach the public.
Okay, I just to give you sort of a broader picture of how difficult this issue is to write about, or how I've and other colleagues have found it challenging. I moved to this job from covering the 2008 race for the White House between, you know, that epic battle between Obama and Clinton. And as I was taking over the job, my editor said to me, are you sure you want to do this? Because I have to tell you, every time I read the word greenhouse gas emissions, my eyes glaze over and I fall asleep. And I thought, oh my God, you know, career death. How can I be going about covering the environment? Because I thought it was really important. So there's just an inherent challenge and difficulty in writing about science. And if you have to write about science, politics, and policy at the same time, it just becomes that much more difficult. What you're looking for is language that is very clear and precise, and yet that can't be twisted and distorted. So, for example, the sort of agonizing choices you can make over words like belief. You know, do you believe in global warming? Well, it can have all kinds of connotations. The use of the term global warming, that's difficult because you can open yourself up to, you know, to a misinterpretation, especially on a day like today when it's cold. I think also the issue of denying the science and denial becomes tricky, as I've talked about, because people accuse you of accusing other people of being a Holocaust denier, so it just spreads and spreads. What I have found to be, and these debates don't take place in the media environment specifically about climate change. they involve other spheres. I mean, the Middle East, we used to have these debates about, do we call them terrorists, do we call them militants, do we call them Islamists? You know, language, terminology are very tricky things when we're talking about highly charged subjects. For me, what I've tried as a guide is to try and use language that's specific and that's accessible and clear. I have trouble actually saying that word anthropogenic. It's like a miracle. I managed it just now, so I will not use that. I will not say man-made because I don't like using gender kind of language. You know, so I would say that humans are human-caused climate change. I think that's really important because one sort of slippery thing that people do is sort of say, well, I believe in climate change, but I believe it's happening naturally and it's been going on for thousands of years. So you want to get away from that. But again, I don't think it's about the science of climate change. I think it's about blocking solutions to climate change, of blocking government regulation. So I tend to put those terms together just as a solution. People who deny the existence of climate change and oppose action on climate change. And that's my personal little device for dealing with that.
And actually, we are so running out of time, and I'm sorry because this has been a great discussion. Just a brief comment by both of you about the responsibility of the scientific community to learn how to talk to everyday people.
Yeah, it's a really, really difficult issue. I guess the biggest problem I think the scientific community has is what I call the conception of real work. So if you talk to scientists who have taken some time to speak to the media or to go to a workshop with journalists, they'll always say, I've got to get back to my real work. You know, and the real work is in the laboratory or, you know, drilling isotopes or whatever. And on one level I'm sympathetic to that because of course that's why scientists became scientists, because they wanted to do science. But on the other hand, I think part of what we've learned from experience is that that is kind of a dream. The idea that you could just drill your ice cores or just collect your blood samples from the seafloor and not somehow get pulled into these larger spheres of social and political and economic issues, it's just not the way the world is. Scientists are called upon to speak up and to respond. Something does get leaked. And when the IPCC says, no, you know, we're pure, we just do science, we have these rules, we can't respond to that, well, they do a lot of damage. And so I think the scientific community, in a way, it's like the scientific community is being very unscientific about the reality that we face. The reality is we live in a world where science and politics and economics are now implicated in a kind of multifarious, multivalent problem, right? And so scientists need to think that through, and that means that they need to probably take some classes in communication. They need to think about their writing. It means the way we educate scientists needs to shift a little bit, and I've been part of efforts to do that now in a couple of institutions. And usually the response of scientists is, it's a good idea, but we don't have time for that. You know, we can't give up anything in the scientific curriculum to do that. And my answer to that is to say, well, I understand that. I understand the importance of differential equations and thermodynamics, but what is the use of all of this great science if it doesn't get the traction you want in the world because of these other, you know, economic and social dimensions? If you want your work to have the impact that you think it should have, then you have to engage with these other dimensions of the problem.
Why don't we get a couple of questions with one provision. Could we start with students in the audience, and could you identify yourself and also make it a very quick question, because obviously we are closing in on the hour. So,
Thank you. I'm Jennifer Austin. I'm at the Kennedy School in the International Development Program. Given these parallels, I'm just wondering, in terms of a breakthrough, what you guys would say are some specific types of lessons learned on things that could be done. I think scientists have work to do on how they communicate, but what were some of the breakthroughs in the tobacco discussion or anything else that we might be able to learn from?
Yeah, well, I thought about this a lot when I was writing Merchants of Doubt, and I have to say that I think, you know, tobacco wasn't just one thing, it was a lot of things, and so one of the lessons is that it isn't one thing. You have to work on a lot of different fronts, and certainly local and state action, even municipalities, cities that ban smoking in public places, that was really important. But if I had to point to one thing that was really important, it was the U.S. Department of Justice prosecution of the tobacco industry under the RICO statutes. because I think that did two crucial things. It first of all exposed a gigantic amount of evidence about what these people had been doing for 50 years, and that evidence, played a big role in my being able to do the work I did. And the second thing is it basically exposed these people as criminals. These people broke the law. They committed conspiracy to commit fraud against the American people. And that's really important, because I think it's important for us to distinguish between a good corporate citizen who, maybe we want to persuade them that they should make some adjustments, versus a corporation that's really doing things that are evil and nefarious. Sometimes corporations do things that are evil and nefarious, and I think we have to be able and willing to say that. So I see the RICO prosecution as incredibly huge. And if you want another person to invite as a speaker, Sharon Eubanks was the lawyer who led that effort. Great, amazing person, great speaker. So.
Okay, yeah, and actually we would add on that, I think this problem is a little broader in terms of, at the moment some in business and industry are taking a bigger leadership role than certainly Washington. Yeah, go ahead.
I hope this isn't a silly question, but
silly question's really good.
Is there any degree to which one can quantify the degree of hindrance of the disinformation campaigns against things like big tobacco and climate change in comparison to the natural level of torpor that is associated with politics and business?
I think you can see, I think, and Peter, I'm sure would have, I think it was a very big factor. It wasn't the only big factor, but I think it was a very big factor in the reason why it became impossible to get climate change legislation passed in the US. I think that was a very big factor. Because with the 2010 election was when you got this big wave of Republicans who were opposed to the action of climate change getting elected to the House. And the campaign season, just before those midterms, was fought on the issue of energy and was fought on a backlash against the first stage to get climate change legislation, which passed in the House. So I think that is one casualty right there. On the state, as Peter said, it's been less, state level, it's been less successful.
Yeah.
Can I just add one thing? So one of the things that I think makes it hard to answer that question in part is that a lot of the organizations, the think tanks, the front groups, if you will, that are supporting or driving efforts to avoid legislation or to stoke confusion about climate change, their sources of funding are not always known. There's a recent study, Climatic Change by Robert Brule, who highlighted just how little is known about the sources of money that are fueling their efforts, right? And so, in my view, the public has a right to know, and we really need to open up those books so that we can understand where the money's coming from, who's behind it, and to what extent that's really driving inaction.
But also, just quickly, one thing on that. I mean, obviously, quantification is always great if you can do it, but you don't necessarily have to do it to make a persuasive argument. And one of the things we know about this whole thing is that early in the 1990s, around the time of the UN Framework Convention, the fossil fuel industry funded market research to measure the impact of certain kinds of disinformation. So their own studies show, and they quantified the impact of a particular advertising campaign, and I've written about this, I can send you the article. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing you can use to show, hey, these people were trying to measure their own impacts, and they boasted about the fact that they thought they had data that demonstrated that impact.
Question? Another student or? Yeah.
Sorry, I'm actually not a student, but I'm happy to ask a question.
Oh, well, you look like a student.
You look fresh.
And also, if you could identify yourself then and speak very loudly.
Sure. My name's Ari Pesco. I'm an energy fellow at Harvard Law School. You talked about the 97 or 99% consensus, it seems sort of looking back at the last 50 years. Is there a consensus for what is projected to happen over the next 50 years, and how would you characterize, if there is one, how would you characterize what that consensus is?
So it depends on how you parse the question, right? I mean, it's going to depend a lot on the specifics of the question. If you're asking, is there, I mean, I haven't looked at the data, but if you're asking, is there consensus that left unimpeded continued emissions will drive warming on the scale of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius this century, global average, the consensus is very high. You'll see that represented in the IPCC report. That is kind of the official body of what we know. When you get down to very specific questions about impacts at local scales, the uncertainty is higher. But again, the important thing is that, and we've known this really since the second assessment report, maybe earlier, we've known enough to act, right? So the uncertainty, both in terms of the about the specifics of downscale or local impacts, is really, in my view, just not germane to the broader scale of impacts and damages that we have high confidence that we're seeing, in the IPCC characterizes that.
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
My name is Ted.
You had your hand up very first, so.
My question is this, that what sort of game changer do you see in this case, other than some sort of RICO case? I mean, I'm all in favor of more science, but from what Naomi is saying, it doesn't matter. I mean, the science just doesn't penetrate, no matter how good it is. You may need it in order to know what to do, but to change public opinion, which seems to be more and more polarized and more influenced by a polarized blogosphere and right-wing radio stations that are not going to be affected by whatever science that, and given that polling seems to show that the public is now more skeptical than it used to be about climate change.
So can
Perhaps
you
like
add a question mark?
My question was, what can change that situation?
I mean, first of all, I think that despite the fact, I would still say that this is a fringe group that punches above its weight, and that the study, the polling sort of shows back and forth, but the majority of Americans do believe, a small majority, that climate change is well, 56 or something percent.
Believe.
I still think that a majority of Americans accepts that climate change is real and a threat, and that they need to act on it. That is still there. And as Peter said, when you look at the individual sort of ways of dealing with climate change, there is broad acceptance. Everybody just about loves solar panels. People think electric cars are really cool, right? The other interesting thing and the other important thing to note is that there's a lot of business, and a big business and companies that are moving in to this field as well, and that there is sort of some lifestyle choices that people are making that sort of support greener solutions as well. So I don't see the one big, this is sort of cliche of climate, there isn't one silver bullet, but there's a lot of small things moving in the right direction.
But if I can say, I agree with that, and I do think it's extremely hard to know, which is why I think it's important to work on a lot of levels. But I do think there are a couple of things that could be significant. I think a RICO-style prosecution, if a smart lawyer thought there was some aspect of the law that had been broken. Any lawyers in the audience? We should do this again at the law school. I think a Nixon going to China moment, an important conservative leader stepping up to the plate and saying this is real and we need to do it. And if we do it now, we have a better chance of doing it with market-based mechanisms. If we wait, it becomes harder to solve without massive government intervention, which is what I believe. And then third thing is about examples. One of the things I found that's really important when I speak in public, most people have no idea what anyone in the world is doing about this problem. And so when you point out to people that British Columbia has a carbon tax that is successful and is both generating revenue for the province, cutting greenhouse gas emissions, and not wrecking the economy, many people find that quite shocking to discover. And so I found that learning about some of those positive examples, being able to talk about the details of them, and especially in Canada, which is generally viewed as not a communist country, although not always, but I find
it isn't now.
It isn't now, exactly. It might have been in the past.
And we never know what the teachable moment is going to be, right? And there were, in the Canada case, there was also the Waxman hearing in 1994 when the tobacco industry executives said nicotine is not addictive and cigarettes don't cause cancer. And by that time, enough ground had been prepared, right? And we had relatively few media outlets at the time that everybody, not everybody, but a sufficient number of people saw that and knew they were lying, right? And that was a moment in which the social license, to borrow a phrase Naomi has so artfully used in other contexts, for them to act as they had been was really changed. Republican members of Congress began reducing the amount of money they were taking from them as campaign contributions, as were Democrats. There was some, you couldn't have predicted that, right? And we can't really predict. I see us as preparing the ground for whatever the teachable. Maybe it'll be in a heat wave in Chicago. Who knows what it will be? I would say, though, that what really gives me heart in this is to see examples where this is already taking place, again, maybe not given enough amplification in the public or in the media, but my home state is California. In 2010, there was a ballot proposition on the state, in front of the state to roll back the state's Global Warming Pollution Act. It's called AB 32. It was heavily funded by out-of-state fossil oil interests. And if you look at, there's a wonderful slide of the county-by-county voting on that proposition. It was overwhelmingly rejected, right? So the population in the state of California supported retaining quite aggressive reductions in the state. And what was really interesting to me in that slide is that some of the most conservative counties in the state of California, in the Central Valley, for example, in the east of the state, voted overwhelmingly to reject the efforts to overturn that. In part because they were seeing the economic benefits of clean energy in their districts, and because there were these out-of-state fossil energy interests that were trying to tell them what to do. I didn't like that. And so I just think there are some areas of hope that we can draw.
Just one other that might seem unlikely is I would say Jon Stewart and Steve Colbert. Because they, in terms of television coverage, they routinely and regularly get people on their show and they talk about these things in a serious way, and they have a huge mass audience and they've got the younger generation. And I think that's important.
So I really want to thank all three of you, because as you can hear, I think they have extraordinary depth and perspective that could be appreciated by a lot of people following this issue. And I was delighted to get all three of them on one panel and bring that here. So thank you.
Thank you.